Hello, I'm going to be talking a couple of verses from the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 6, verses 25 and 26. Take no thought for your life, what you shall eat or what you shall drink, nor yet for your body, what you shall put on. Behold the fowls of the air, they don't work, but God takes care of them. It's laughable to think that what to most people would have been an enviable situation caused me tremendous embarrassment. I was 25, I had my own flat, my own car, and I'd landed a very exciting job in an advertising agency which gave me opportunities to personally be involved in modelling, beauty contests, fashion shows. Maurice and I, we'd just gone into partnership and were setting up a small recording business which was specifically aimed at Christian artists with the purpose of helping them to make albums in a Christian environment at a cost that they could afford. Although we looked forward to the day when we could give up our jobs and be solely supported by the business, at that particular time, any profit that came in was paying off bank loans and going towards better equipment for the studio. I remember one morning really struggling in prayer. I'd been experiencing this for a few days. The heavens seemed like brass, even though I was trying my best to lead a more disciplined and dedicated life by spending 2 hours each morning before work in prayer and Bible reading. But this particular morning, the struggle just got to me, and I felt I couldn't leave things as they were. I told God that I wouldn't budge from my room until He spoke to me. I remember fighting and speaking out loud in tongues, and it was during this time that God gave me a specific vision, telling me I had to step out in faith. I knew that God was asking me to leave work because He'd been leading up to it for quite some weeks now. And this was one particular thing that I didn't want to do. You see, I loved my work. I loved my independence. I loved my freedom. But God was telling me to give all this up and be available for Him, and I didn't like it. But I know when God speaks, and so that very morning I went into work and I handed in my notice. It wasn't a rash decision. This was an act of obedience. Maurice and I had talked over the situation and decided that I would be given a nominal sum each week from Sharing Records, that was the name of our company, which would pay for my rent and food. And we decided that I had to get rid of my car because this would be too much of a drain on resources. Well, things went okay for a few months. As I was the minister's secretary, there was plenty of church work for me to do. Maurice and I also ran coffee mornings in the church, where we continuously showed videos of the previous Sunday services and held music concerts. Strangers would often wander in through the doors, have a coffee, watch a service, and it gave us great opportunities to witness and invite them to church meetings. I also began to blitz Manchester with tracts, taking a van load of workers from the church twice a week to different areas where we'd spend 2 hours in the morning giving out tracts. We'd then go to the home of one of the church members for soup and rolls, followed by prayer. And then we would continue to give out tracts for a further 2 hours during the afternoon. This proved to be a tremendous time of blessing, and I remember that many of our church members who came out with me were actually filled with the Holy Spirit and received the gifts of prophecy and vision. My instruction from the Lord to leave work and to live by faith was becoming more and more a blessing to me until something completely outside my control took place. The house where I had my flat belonged to 2 old bachelor brothers. They'd lived together all their lives. The characters were totally different. The strong-minded older brother died and left the younger brother, who was in his 70s, a very lonely, frightened man, alone in the house, and he was looking for a tenant to give him some sense of security. Well, I took over the bottom floor of the house and he had his apartment upstairs. And knowing his situation, I did my best to befriend him. I regularly made his Sunday dinner and would take him out in my car to the park some Saturdays. Everything seemed really pleasant until his attitude towards me changed, and I realised that he had completely misunderstood my actions and had become deeply, emotionally involved with me. To put it mildly, I was really frightened to live in the same house as this man. But a married couple who were close friends and lived in a very large house, they immediately asked if I would move in with them. They were very good to me. At that particular time, they had tenants in their house paying rent for the rooms they occupied. But I was given 2 rooms and told that I didn't need to pay rent. They also said, as I didn't have any money, that I could eat with them as part of their family. So now Maurice suggested that as I no longer had to pay rent or buy food, that sharing records would not need to support me financially. So in one fell swoop, my independence was totally cut off. You know, there's a vast difference between having money and deciding not to spend it, and having no money and not being able to spend. I was in a position where I was dependent on this married couple for everything, and I didn't like it one bit. You see, I knew that they were going through hard times financially themselves, and I just felt as though I was an added pressure and burden. I'd been given 2 rooms because they knew I had a lot of furniture and was used to plenty of space around me. But I knew that those 2 rooms could have brought in a good rent each week. Their situation was so bad that some weeks I remember them actually taking paintings from the wall and selling them to raise the rent. Some weeks I'd actually give them some articles of mine that could bring in some money when sold. At that time, the wife was working 1 day a week in a second-hand store, and she'd often come home with articles of clothing for me because she knew that I couldn't afford to buy clothes myself any longer. Although I appreciated her kindness and consideration, it embarrassed me tremendously. And every time I sat around the table to eat a meal with the family, I felt like an intruder and constantly felt uncomfortable. As soon as the dishes were cleared, I'd dash up to my room and I would stay there for the remainder of the evening. But then this caused problems because they thought that I just didn't want to socialise with them. A few months after I'd moved in with this family, Maurice's 2 sisters invited me to share a holiday with them, saying that I didn't need to pay anything because they'd taken care of everything. I was in an awful situation where I felt under obligation to everybody. I decided to have a word with the minister of the church and tell him how I felt. So the next time I went to the office, I poured out my heart to him. I was really amazed at his reaction. Instead of being sympathetic and understanding, he told me that I was the most ungrateful person he'd ever come across. I was absolutely shocked at what he said. But he continued and told me that God had called me to work for him full time and to live by faith. And God had proved the call by providing for me this family who were prepared to take me on, even though I was an added burden on their financial resources. If I hadn't accepted their hospitality and generosity, then I'd not have been able to give up work and be full time for God. As I was single, I couldn't support myself financially. He also reminded me that God could see everything that this married couple were doing, and that one day he would reward them personally for all the efforts that they'd put into obeying his voice. And that if I was to refuse their kindness now, I'd be robbing them of a tremendous blessing later. I tried hard to defend myself, telling him that it wasn't that I was ungrateful. I just felt as though I was a terrible burden on this family. But he ignored me totally and said I was very proud and very independent, and that God had probably placed me in this very situation just so that these characteristics could be dealt with. I've learned from personal experience that living by faith is more than expecting God to supply your material needs. It's becoming completely vulnerable and dependent on God for everything. And it hurts very much until you've submitted. And at that point, it becomes the most exciting, carefree life that anybody could hope for. You've been warned. God bless you.